It began as a rumor, an inexplicable retreat, a whole division pulling back from ground they could have held. The reports arrived at Allied command like whispers carried by cold wind, enemy units withdrawing in the dead of night, abandoning fortified ridges, supply depots, even pre-sighted artillery positions. No major offensive, no tanks, no bombardment, just the steady disappearance of German troops from a sector that should have been unshakable. And in their place, scattered footprints of something that shouldn't have existed at all. World War II was a conflict shaped not only by firepower but by shadows, by the manipulation of perception, by the careful weaponization of fear, routine, expectation. In the long catalogue of military deception, one episode stood out as a quiet masterpiece, the moment an entire division retreated from an army that wasn't there. It was a victory won with canvas, air pumps, forged signals, rehearsed illusions, and a handful of soldiers who understood that if you control what the enemy sees, you control what they believe. Across a barren stretch of woodland and open fields, the story began with nothing more than a cleared patch of ground and a few crates marked with innocuous supply labels. To any passing aircraft, it was just another nondescript clearing. But the men who stepped out from the trucks that evening belonged to a unit the public rarely knew existed. The deception specialists who operated behind the thin membrane separating truth from fabrication. They carried no heavy weapons, no armored vehicles, no artillery. Instead, they brought rolls of canvas, hollow frames, air hoses, portable generators, and the disciplined confidence of illusionists preparing a stage. By the time the first gray light seeped across the horizon, the forms had begun to take shape. What hours earlier had been emptiness was now the outline of a military encampment. Tents aligned with mathematical precision, supply stacks placed in patterns consistent with divisional logistics, even tire tracks etched deliberately into the soil with weighted rollers. To a reconnaissance camera, everything looked legitimate. War in the Second World War often depended on reading these images quickly, under pressure, with only a few seconds to distinguish real threats from cleverly arranged debris. The men crafting this scene relied on that pressure like a silent ally. Nearby, vast inflatable silhouettes slowly rose, trembling as they filled with air, then fixing into immovable poses. Hulking tanks that weighed less than a single soldier's gear but cast shadows like armored beasts. They were shaped from wartime rubber, the same material used for life rafts and weather balloons, but molded with uncanny accuracy. Once painted, dusted, and positioned under camouflage nets, they became indistinguishable from real armor at altitude. Not because the deception crews expected enemy pilots to miss details, but because wartime reconnaissance rarely allowed them to look twice. A single blurred photograph could determine the movement of entire battalions. Radio operators joined the operation next, setting up their equipment under canvas tarps designed to mimic field headquarters. Their role was as vital as the visual illusions. They transmitted patterns of traffic, instructions, coded updates, unit chatter, all meticulously crafted to match the communications of a full division. The frequencies were chosen with surgical precision, aligned with schedules intelligence believed the enemy monitored. Every operator played a part, adopting call signs, habits, and linguistic quirks of real units. They were actors disguised as soldiers, performing for ears that would never know their faces. As their signals drifted across the night air, the deception became more than physical. It became psychological. The enemy believed that radio discipline reflected strength, cohesion, and readiness. Hearing the chatter was often enough to confirm that a powerful force had taken position. The deception unit used that belief as their foundation, constructing an auditory presence far larger than their numbers could ever suggest. The men worked methodically, building their elaborate fiction under the veil of darkness. From a distance, the soft glow of lanterns seemed purposeful, steady, as if hundreds of soldiers moved through tasks in silence. By the time the sun returned, the field was alive with detail. Ropes, crates, weapon racks, tire marks, even boots positioned near tent flaps to imply a full night's rest. Nothing was left random. Disorder, too, was staged with intention. High above, the first reconnaissance flight passed over the site. The scene below was convincing. Rows of tents, vehicles, armored silhouettes, radio lines, campfires reduced to thin white smoke by careful timing. The pilot could capture only a few frames before banking back toward the cloud line, but those frames were enough. Intelligence officers behind enemy lines would soon examine the photographs, overlay them on existing maps, and confirm their suspicions. A sizable Allied force was deploying on the flank. In the surrounding forests, teams erected more visual cues. Camouflage nets strung between trees, weapon emplacements crafted from wood and canvas but painted to reflect metal under sunlight, decoy foxholes sprinkled with fresh earth to look recently dug. Soldiers hauling gear added noise to the forest floor. Broken twigs, heavy prints, wheel ruts. Everything had to feel lived in when enemy scouts peered through binoculars from ridge lines kilometers away. Night brought a new layer of illusion. Campfires flickered in prearranged patterns, their smoke drifting gently across the treetops. From afar, it looked like a battalion settling in for the night. The deception crew maintained the fires with meticulous timing. Never too bright, never too few. The goal was continuity, the appearance of routine within a unit of hundreds, even though only a handful of men tended the flames. War's shadows often hold more power at night when imagination fills the dark spaces between what one sees and what one fears. The enemy scouts watching from their hidden posts saw exactly what they expected, a force large enough to threaten their position by dawn. The pressure built slowly, like a storm forming behind a ridge. Enemy commanders reading the developing reports believed a major Allied maneuver was underway. The faked radio logs were intercepted and misinterpreted as confirmation. Surveillance photographs matched the illusion. The deception unit had done exactly what they were trained for: weaponize the enemy's assumptions. Inside the enemy's forward positions, the mood shifted from cautious observation to growing anxiety. Artillery spotters struggled to reconcile their earlier calculations with the new imagery. The sudden appearance of Allied armor on their flank was a nightmare scenario. A mechanized breakthrough could cut lines, sever supply routes, or encircle entire regiments. Even if the threat was ambiguous, hesitation could be fatal. And in World War II, commanders often preferred preemptive withdrawal over risking annihilation. The first signs of retreat came quietly. Patrols pulled back from their outposts. Machine gun nests went silent. The deception crews listened to changes in the enemy's radio traffic. Uncertainty, reassignments, requests for reinforcements. Each fragment told the same story. The enemy was repositioning. They were preparing to yield ground without a fight. What happened next unfolded much faster than expected. Within a day, enemy infantry columns began withdrawing along forest roads, leaving behind weapons pits, observation posts, and forward ammunition caches. Trucks rumbled away under tarp-covered loads, their taillights vanishing into the fog. The deception team watched through field glasses as soldiers who had held the ridge for months abandoned it to a ghost army. Back at their command center, enemy officers stared at reconnaissance overlays in confusion. The scale of the supposed Allied force made no sense. The timing didn't match known logistical movements. Yet every data point, every photograph, every intercepted transmission, every scout report insisted the threat was real. It was a textbook case of perception overriding logic. Fear filled the gaps that information couldn't. Allied intelligence continued to feed the illusion. New radio patterns were introduced to suggest reinforcements. Fake map notations were allowed to fall into enemy hands. Every tactic used was rooted in real deception doctrine, the same principles that underpinned the most successful operations of the Second World War, including the vast misdirection preceding D-Day. This operation, though smaller in scale, demonstrated the same brilliance. A masterful synchronization of visual theatrics, radio artifice, and psychological manipulation. As the ridge fell silent, the deception unit moved quickly to assess their impact. What they found astonished even the most seasoned operatives. An entire division had retreated. Defensive lines once thought immovable now lay empty. The battlefield felt hollow, like a stage after the actors had departed. They had won a battle without firing a shot. Behind them, scattered across the empty fields, stood the proof of their work. Inflatable vehicles anchored to the soil, still holding their shape. Fake equipment arranged with mathematical care. Stacks of props waiting to be packed away. The illusion had served its purpose. Soon it would be gone, leaving nothing but trampled grass and disturbed earth. And somewhere in an enemy archive, a file would be stamped and stored away. An account of a withdrawal that military historians would one day struggle to explain. The battlefield they inherited was silent, stripped of the tension that had hung over the region only days earlier. The enemy's abrupt withdrawal left behind trenches half filled with rainwater, abandoned ammunition crates, and a scattering of personal items. Testimony to how quickly the retreat had been executed. The deception unit moved carefully through the former front line, aware that every footprint they saw had been shaped not by overwhelming firepower but by carefully sculpted illusions. In a war defined by brutal attrition and grinding offensives, moments like this felt unreal. Soldiers were trained to expect decisive clashes, artillery duels, and the roar of tank engines. Instead, victory had arrived like a cold breath through the trees, unseen and unstoppable. No shots fired, no losses, just the steady collapse of an opponent's certainty. Back at Allied headquarters, analysts pieced together the larger implications of what had occurred. Although the operation was small compared to giant Allied deceptions like Fortitude South or the global misdirection surrounding Operation Bodyguard, its precision made it legendary among intelligence circles. Analysts studied aerial photographs showing the fake encampment. They compared intercepted radio logs with the fabricated traffic broadcast by the deception team. They reviewed maps showing how quickly the enemy realigned their divisions once they believed their flank was compromised. Every line pointed to the same conclusion. This was a perfect storm in the psychology of warfare. The enemy needed only a nudge, one convincing thread of false information to unravel their strategic confidence. The deception unit had given them far more than a nudge. They had crafted a full tapestry of threat, woven with such meticulous detail that even hardened veterans fell for it. For the soldiers who carried out the deception, the aftermath was a strange mixture of relief and quiet pride. They dismantled their work piece by piece, deflating the tanks that had terrified reconnaissance officers, rolling up the canvas that had mimicked the weight and structure of heavy armor. The dummy artillery positions were knocked down, their hollow wooden frames revealing just how fragile the illusion truly was once approached up close. The men moved with practiced efficiency, aware that their operation would leave no trace once they were done. That was part of their doctrine. Deception units were ghosts by design. They appeared, reshaped the battlefield, and vanished before anyone realized what had truly happened. Their files circulated only in classified channels, their successes discussed in whispered briefings. By the time historians learned of their work decades later, most of the participants had long since returned to civilian life, never revealing how they once shifted the weight of war with little more than air, cloth, and calculated imagination. Enemy documents recovered after the war filled in the other side of the story. Within their command hierarchy, confusion had spiraled rapidly. Initial reconnaissance photographs suggested a buildup of Allied armor, but it was the radio traffic, meticulously forged by the deception operators, that pushed their concern into full alarm. Intercept specialists flagged the transmissions as authentic. Field commanders responded with urgency, requesting permission to reposition their defenses. The fear of encirclement, a recurring nightmare during the Second World War, drove their decision-making. Past defeats had taught them that staying too long in the wrong position could destroy entire divisions. Retreat, then, was not cowardice. It was instinct shaped by years of brutal fighting. The Phantom Battalion, as Allied soldiers later called it, had exploited that instinct with masterful precision. As the deception unit packed their gear, they reflected on the moral weight of their work. They knew deception saved lives, Allied lives, and even enemy ones. Every retreat triggered by illusion was a battle avoided, a clash that never turned farmland into cratered wasteland. Yet they also understood the darker edge of what they wielded, the power to manipulate fear, to warp perception, to make men act against their own logic. In an era defined by industrialized conflict, the human mind remained a potent battlefield. The broader war moved on, relentless and consuming. But the legacy of operations like this one endured in the strategic fabric of World War II. Deception became not just a supporting tactic, but a central pillar of Allied planning. Before the Normandy landings, entire ghost armies were deployed to mislead the Wehrmacht about invasion points. Massive networks of dummy airfields, inflatable aircraft, decoy supply depots, and scripted radio chatter shaped the enemy's interpretation of Allied intentions. The Phantom Battalion was part of the same lineage, a small, precise example of the grand illusion that stretched across Europe from 1943 to 1945. Deception manuals from the era preserved their methods in stark, typewritten language. They emphasized the psychology of observation, the belief that the enemy would interpret incomplete information through the lens of their expectations. If they feared armor, show them armor. If they feared a breakthrough, simulate the signs of one. If they relied on radio intercepts, give them traffic that aligned perfectly with their deepest anxieties. The success of the Phantom Battalion exemplified that doctrine. It demonstrated that warfare wasn't solely about overwhelming enemy strength. It was about shaping enemy understanding. In the final days of the operation, Allied officers walked the now quiet ridge, studying the abandoned enemy positions. They found hastily scribbled notes, rushed map adjustments, and scattered messages left behind during the withdrawal. One note, left on a desk in a makeshift command shack, read like a confession of fear. Enemy armor advancing on left flank, urgent repositioning required. The armor, of course, was nothing more than rubber and air. But to the men who fled, it was the shadow of a catastrophe they were determined to avoid. Once the deception crew cleared the field, the ground returned to silence. The forests swallowed the last traces of tire tracks. The wind erased footprints along the ridge. Days later, Allied forces moved into the area and advanced beyond it, now facing an enemy line weakened by its own misinterpretation. Momentum on the front shifted slightly, just enough for the next stage of Allied planning to take hold. That subtle shift, amplified across dozens of similar operations, contributed to larger strategic outcomes. Every German division misallocated because of deceptive signals weakened their defenses elsewhere. Every withdrawal preserved Allied manpower and equipment for the critical offensives to come, and every deception, no matter how small, added weight to the great machinery of Allied victory. But the Phantom Battalion remained distinctive because it represented deception in its purest form. One illusion, executed flawlessly, rippling outward until it changed the shape of a battlefield. Years later, when classified wartime files were finally opened, researchers found the faded, dust-coated folder that documented the operation. Inside were reconnaissance photographs of the dummy tanks, notes on radio frequency patterns, sketches of camp layouts, and after-action reports describing the enemy retreat. The language was clinical, detached, standard military phrasing describing an outcome anything but ordinary. One analyst, summarizing the operation, wrote a single line that would echo through intelligence circles. Enemy division withdrew in response to non-existent Allied formation. A retreat triggered by shadows, a maneuver shaped by imagination, a victory without violence. In the broader tapestry of World War II, this operation was a footnote, yet it captured something essential about the nature of the conflict. The Second World War was not only fought in trenches, in tank assaults, or in the skies over embattled cities. It was fought in the minds of commanders, in the interpretations of reconnaissance photographs, in the patterns of radio waves drifting across night skies. It was a war in which information, true or false, could move armies as surely as steel and fire. When historians look back, they see the grand strategies, the massive offensives, the staggering casualty lists. But behind them were moments like this. Quiet, nearly invisible acts of ingenuity that bypassed destruction and reshaped events without leaving a trail of devastation. The Phantom Battalion was a reminder that innovation in wartime often emerged from unexpected places. From workshops where technicians glued rubber seams, from tents where radio operators rehearsed fake traffic, from forests where soldiers built illusions out of canvas and conviction. As the war ended and Europe began the long task of rebuilding, the men of the deception units dispersed into civilian life. Their work remained classified for decades. Many never spoke of what they had done. Their victories lacked the markers of traditional heroism. No medals earned in assault, no photographs of glorious charges. Instead, they carried the quiet knowledge that they had saved lives through deception rather than destruction. Today, their legacy endures in military doctrine worldwide. Modern psychological operations, electronic warfare, and misinformation strategies all draw from the techniques pioneered in the 1940s. The battlefield of perception that they carved out has only expanded, becoming a domain as critical as land, sea, or air. But even as warfare evolves, the essence remains the same. What an enemy believes shapes what an enemy does. The Phantom Battalion proved that beyond doubt, and as the last page of the declassified file notes in faint type struck by a wartime typewriter, the operation succeeded because the illusion was never discovered. In those words lies the true moral weight of the story. History is often written by battles won with force, but sometimes its course is bent quietly, by shadows cast in the right place, at the right moment, by men who understood that the human mind is the most decisive battlefield of all.